from me. Thank you very much for inviting me to come here today and yesterday and the day before. Very happy to be here, very happy to the organizers, and I'll actually think about them for the next year or so when I try to shed the 4 or 5 kilos that I'm gaining from the very nice food you have down here. But it's been very, very pleasant indeed, I must say. Also, coming from Latvia, it's very new for me this year that being invited, if not to be sort of a role model, but actually to speak about Latvian experience, and also experience that actually perhaps could be followed or might have to be followed. We're certainly not used to that. But I will concentrate, therefore, mostly on this internal devaluation process that we have been through and for which the country has been, quite frankly, very, very much vilified by many, and certainly not trusted to that it would be possible to go through this process. And why is that interesting? Well, of course, because that's what you and several other countries in the Eurozone, you're sort of forced into. We have the choice of an external devaluation instead of the currency. And I will try to argue at various points in my presentation, why is it that the Latvian authorities, did not choose to do that. I guess I'm also here a little bit because we are, just like with the Estonians, shall we say, a little bit ahead in the business cycle there. We're sort of coming out of the tunnel, seeing light, hoping the best for growth and so forth, right? But certainly we've already been through sort of 2-3 years of recession and seeing growth right now. And then also, I guess I'm here coming from Latvia, this country that in 2009 was, you know, very much in the headlines. And let me just try to start there. So, President of Latvia, and if you see this from this speech, it's the official English translation, back in June 2009, 2 years ago, right? These are very, very strong words, and I don't imagine you see them being said that often in any countries. Will our country exist or not exist? But that's more or less what it looked like. 2009 was very, very precarious indeed, and everybody, or very many at least, were looking at that country, seeing what on earth is going on there. Right? We had the biggest boom in the European Union. We certainly also had the biggest recession, and therefore many eyes were coming in our direction simply because the numbers there were so extreme. Otherwise, when I go through my presentation, which is based almost entirely on Latvia, I would say that please think about Raul's presentation also, because there was also data about Latvia, and a lot of the things that happened in Latvia was also, they happened in Estonia. The numbers were just a little bit more extreme. But here, for instance, is one that implicitly was also in Raul's presentation, development of GDP. Yes, one of the reasons for why Latvia has been looked upon again is this year that we had the most massive recession of all the EU countries and possibly in the world in this period, a cumulative drop of GDP of about 1/4. But again, yeah, sending the economy back a lot, but only, so to speak, 5 years, which is very much what happened in other countries too. I often call it the story of, you know, the harder they come, the harder they fall. We had huge growth, and after that we also had a huge decline. But in terms of time, we are only, so to speak, only 5 years back. Right? Not so much here, I think, but as I will try to argue also, Latvian economic policy was well, not very good, much worse than Estonian. The Estonians, we don't like to say this, but we must admit that Estonians are typically better than we are, and they certainly were in this context. Right? The Latvians at the end of 2008 had to turn to the IMF and the European Union for support. Basically, there in December of 2008, it was weeks before the government would be unable to pay wages, and I'm certain that had that been the case, without this package, we would have basically state bankruptcy, the currency would have gone, the banking system would have been gone. Right? So Latvia was helped by an amount of money which is huge by Latvian standards, 35% of GDP, but tiny, of course, by international standards. And I think this big amount, that was not so much to help the Latvians, rather it was to avoid contagion and thereby help Estonians, Lithuanians, Swedes, Ukraine, and so forth, right? But very tough, and in this process, we've been through some really, really serious fiscal cuts that I'm quite uncertain of whether other countries can replicate. The total consolidation of Latvia is in around 16% of GDP at the moment, which is very, very much in such a relative short period of time in which this has been implemented. And from the little figure there, as you can see, the guy to the left is talking about that the whole seems to be very, very big, whereas if you know the geography of the Baltics, the guy to the right must be Raul, actually, right? Because that's an Estonian chipping in to our stabilization. Thank you, Raul. And again, here coming back to this year, that was it discussed whether there should be a devaluation? Yes, the IMF actually sort of was suggested that there should be an external devaluation. But here, and again in my presentation, I'll come back to this, in Latvia, the authorities will not hear about an external devaluation. My arguments for that, they will come a little bit later. But here, if you can see what it says in blue, otherwise let me just mention it quickly. The Bank of Latvia will never take part in any loan negotiations where money is promised in exchange for an altered national currency rate. And very many foreign observers, A, didn't really understand this, and B, definitely underestimated sort of, shall we say, how much the central bank, or how far the central bank would go in supporting the fixed exchange rate of the country. That, I think, is still not understood by most foreign observers. But it's a very, not just Latvian thing, also very Estonian thing. We have a fixed exchange rate, we believe in it very much, and undoing it is the worst of all cases. Few words that was said, I mentioned a few observers there. Paul Krugman, for instance, had several comments, some of them rather scathing. Latvia is the new Argentina. This one I love, I must admit. It hurt when he said it, but meanwhile things could be worse, and in Latvia they are, right? Or this one, they've made it this desert and called it successful adjustment. That was actually mainly about Estonia, but there we are, right? No, good points and so on, but one person being very much against this attempt at the internal devaluation, a few others here, Nouriel Rubini, and to the left, just to show that I understand Swedish language also, but this Björn Wallros, I might not be so well known here, but he is up north, right, from Finland, and basically saying that the warning words of Wallros that it's absurd to believe that it's in the interest of anyone to maintain an overvalued currency, right? So lots of names out there basically saying what you're doing is impossible and stupid. Perhaps it was. Right? Here's another one. This was when days were really crazy. I mean, this is also very close to this address by the president. But here, the former governor of the Swedish central bank, Bengt Dennis, and I remember that day, he was part of a task force hired by the Latvian prime minister. So when he said this here, it's not a question of if Latvia will devalue, it's a question of when and how. Then it was on Swedish television, and down there on the television it said, advisor to the prime minister of Latvia. The day after, interest rates skyrocketed, and there was a huge currency outflow that week. But still, the exchange rate remained, of course. And here again, Bank of Latvia came out, you know, just a couple of days later. And again, to sort of try to reassure the markets and all internal and external observers, right, stability of the lats will be maintained until the moment it is replaced with the euro. But still very much underestimated by abroad that they will take whatever pain in form of GDP cuts, rise in unemployment, so on. They will not touch the exchange rate. Right. And as it also says a little bit further down, Bank of Latvia will not conduct any experiments with the lats. This was a credible threat, so to speak. Just very few believed at it at the time. And in a sense, you could say, fair enough, right? Here's sort of the picture that I think very many people have seen. This about the loss of competitiveness of many of the countries down here and sort of vis-a-vis Germany. But if you take the same numbers, right, real effective exchange rate here, and also introduce Latvia, or even take it in this picture, then it gets very, very extreme, right? I mean, this should indicate an absolutely huge and humongous loss of competitiveness of Latvia vis-a-vis basically everybody else, right? And therefore, of course, giving rise to that, some would say the only way out of this is to devalue the exchange rate. Well, it depends a little bit on the numbers you look at. Our central bank, which I must admit is also sometimes a little bit good at massaging data, I don't think they do that, but you know, it depends on the eyes that see. This is the data that they use themselves. If you look at the red one there, then it says that yes, there was a loss of competitiveness, real effective exchange rate, right? Our prices in Latvia compared to foreign prices adjusted for exchange rates. So rising, losing competitiveness, but then also coming down again. And this year indicating that, well, we're sort of back. And I have some more numbers to support that, well, even though this picture is very, very extreme in the context of seemingly having a huge loss of competitiveness, then it hasn't affected exports very much, right? Yes, they declined there sort of 2008-09, but that's what happened. That was during the financial crisis, what happened in most countries, right? And then there's been sort of a reasonably steady increase since then. And with this index here, I have that exports are basically 70, and this is in nominal terms, I have to admit, there was not a good index in real terms, but inflation shouldn't have been so big over that short period. But basically, you know, 70% up since, shall we say, the beginning of the crisis, which doesn't look very much like the country can be that under-competitive. And actually, the feeble growth that we have, not so high as in Estonia, but positive again, basically only comes from exports. Internal demand is still very, very weak. Just a little bit about this here, about this internal devaluation again. Where did things go wrong? They went wrong very much in the labor market, for instance. And again, if you look at the numbers here, it's not very strange what happened. We had an overheated labor market, and then wages will go up. The extreme thing about Latvia actually is that the numbers are just so absolutely extreme. So we had years when wages were increasing about 30% a year. Very good, as I say, except my wages didn't do that, so it must have been somebody else, right? But also this year, harsh adjustment. If you look at the red line there, the public sector wages then declining on a 25%, right? And that's, you know, very, very serious adjustment. But again, like in Estonia, this is possible. In a country like Latvia, nobody has been demonstrating against that. Has been nothing, no unrest because of this. But of course, yeah, with sort of this extreme wage growth, what you get also, of course, is extreme inflation. And there again, Latvian numbers were extreme. We ended up with almost 18% of inflation back in May 2008. Then less than 2 years later, in February of 2010, inflation was the most negative of the European Union, deflation at -4%. That's a huge adjustment also, 22 percentage points in basically the same amount of month. Also very much unseen. And this is where, and I think I very much agree with Raul here, is possibly why we can be successful with this internal devaluation. I mean, it hurts. It certainly hurts. But whatever you can say about the Latvian economy, you must admit that it's very, very flexible. Perhaps sort of perversely flexible also. But we had a growth rate of +12 that was then turned into -18. You can read many of the other numbers, but take, for instance, something like the current account deficit. A turnaround in less than 3 years from -26% of GDP to +14. That's a 40 percentage point change. I haven't seen such a change for any country in the world ever, quite frankly. Unemployment, just like in Estonia, shot up. I mean, this from 5 to 20% happened in just over a year. Right? Very sad flexibility, but very strong flexibility. The only thing, and that's at the bottom of the slide, that was absolutely inflexible, that was the nominal exchange rate. The LATs to the euro, not a currency board system, but more or less operating like one, but allowing for fluctuation of ±1%. Raul mentioned that fiscal policy in Estonia was rather pro-cyclical. Well, not as much as ours, and you know, this is not a contest, but there we are, right? But just try to look at this here, right? These are from what we in Latvia call the fat years, 2004, 5, 6, 7, and 8, quarterly spending by the government. And if you look at the columns to which the arrows point, you will see this is fourth quarter of the respective years. Suddenly these columns are much higher than the previous columns. Why? Well, during the growth years, then tax revenue was very, very high, unexpectedly high. What do you do with a lot of tax revenue? Do you put it aside? No, you don't. You spend, right? Bonuses for people in the public sector and stuff like that. 2006, for instance, is completely extreme. Fourth quarter spending over third quarter spending, there's a difference there of more than 60%. I think that is irresponsible fiscal policy, and the government of the time of Latvia is very much to blame for overheating the economy as much as we had it. And here are just a couple of examples of that. Our former transport minister, Mr. Schlesers, was asked on Latvian television once, but what about the imbalances of the economy? We're growing so fast, we have this huge current account deficit, inflation is so high. What should we do about it? And his answer was, well, just continue, put the pedal to the metal, full speed ahead. Or the incompetence of the person to the right. That was the 1st of April when many of us got an email with this little picture sort of trying to fool us into that this was a new memorial coin for Latvia of 0 lats. But Mr. Slakteris in 2008, shortly before we got the IMF package, was asked in a Bloomberg television appearance, but Mr. Slakteris, with all, with what is going on right now, with the negotiations with the IMF and the European Union, what will be the impact on Latvia? And then he thought about it for a while and said the now very infamous words in Latvia, nothing special. Right? It doesn't speak very well for me, right? And I really put the blame, most of the blame for the overheating of the economy there on the politicians. I should say on the politicians of the time. These here are no longer in power. But also, if I try to put this together, then perhaps one could say, the exports are not doing so badly, right? Is it really so much a question of that it was, focusing on competitiveness only? Perhaps it wasn't like that. The whole thing was more, we should perhaps look more at that there was simply these massive capital flows that came into the country from many of the foreign banks into this credit bubble that we have. That is what more that we should look at. And therefore also this Latvia is a new Argentina and so on. Perhaps it's just not such a meaningful comparison. Certainly I don't think so. And now it's 2.5 years ago since Paul Krugman said that Latvia is a new Argentina, but it hasn't materialized, right? Then I can come to, and I look at the time, of course, I see that I'm still doing okay, yeah. So what is it with those Latvians? Why is it so religious this year that to avoid external devaluation? It is this feeling of Pandora's box. There are only bad things that can come out of an external devaluation. I have 10 points, but I'll walk through them quite quickly. When we look at a devaluation in Latvia, then we don't think about sort of 3%, 6%, 8% devaluations that you might have had in Sweden or in Denmark and countries like that earlier on. No, we look at or think about Russia because that's what we can remember. Oh, Belarus, right? I mean, just this week, basically, Belarus devalued by 55%, Russia devalued by some 75% back there in sort of 98. And so we don't think about small devaluations. We're sort of fearing currency collapse instead, right? Or this quotation that I like from somebody from the IMF once, in developing countries, there are no small devaluations. We don't like to think of ourselves as a developing country, perhaps, but perhaps we do, right? And also believing this here, like with Russia or with many other countries, that you cannot do a controlled devaluation. It'll be disorderly, it'll be a currency collapse instead. Of course, certainly there at the end of 2008, I very much believe in that. Had there been an external devaluation, it would have put enormous pressure on the exchange rates in Estonia and Lithuania and elsewhere. Right? And I have no doubt that there would have been contagion at the time. Plus we have, with the, as like for the Estonians, euro adoption is a very strong goal. Not just as monetary policy, but also simply as further integration into the European Union. It is very much what the Latvians, and for that matter also the Lithuanians, what they want. We want this further integration. And plus we believe that adoption of the euro is sort of an anchor, disciplinary device. Didn't work so well in the fat years, but there's a strong belief in that is the way to do it right now. And yeah, I think so. Plus this year, when would it have been good to devalue? Well, perhaps in 2008, but I really don't believe you could have done an orderly devaluation in those very, very strange months of Lehman Brothers collapse and what have you, the banks freezing and lending freezing and so on. In that sense, the right timing was never really there, I think. And then doing it right now, well, it's a little bit like kicking a man who is lying down. First you send people through the internal devaluation, you see their wages being cut, and then after that you go out and give them an external devaluation. That is perhaps actually too rough. Right? Yeah, strong belief in a nominal anchor. I think it's coming from before. Plus this year that one should look at the Baltic countries, or no, in Latvia in this case, and say they are very, very Euroized. People borrow in euros, they save in euros, everybody knows what the exchange rate is, meaning everybody is fully aware of what the currency value is. And plus, we all have bank accounts where, let's say from your net bank, just click, 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 and you can move from Lats into many other currencies. My own very, very simple banking card gives me the opportunity to move between 15 different currencies. Should I suddenly wake up at night and wish to switch my Lats into Czech koruna, I can do so. Haven't done that though, but I could if I would. Plus also we have lacked at a time very much public debate, and this is partly because, and there I will blame the central bank. The central bank has been very much in favor of keeping a lid on the public debate there. I think that was a mistake, and I think they have changed their mind now, and things are much more open, right? Let's move on. This is more what I fear, and this is where we should be looking, right? This year that, and I think if we think back on the presentation yesterday about Greece, this is also what Greece could do, right? Sort of via a big credit boom, they could borrow themselves to some convergence. But a demand boom is not sustainable, and then that's certainly the case here for Latvia, right? I mean, we moved ahead so fast, but are now being sort of, shall we say, sent back to perhaps where we belong. That's a little bit nasty way to put it. And when I look ahead, this year I'll just do quickly. People talk very much about when will we be back to the heights of 2007, and basically the idea is we never will. In pink up there and also in blue are the numbers that are relevant. We reached an employment level back in 2007 of 1.15 million people. It's never going to be reached again. Partly there was so much overheating in the labor market at the time, but also there has been immigration since then. Plus we have a demographic crunch that is basically starting right now that will imply that we never get the same amount of employment once again, meaning the big growth rates of the past, they're just not going to happen once again. And here also, yeah, people talk about this 25% of decline. Well, partly it's explained by that the economy was overheated and was estimated to operate 16% above its average already. Anyway, this is the goal of Latvian monetary policy at the moment. Here you have the Estonian euro, it does exist. To the right you have the Latvian euro, it does not exist. It's a funny one with 2008. Should you ever find that, keep it. It must be very seldom, right? And yes, I mean, no changes there. Whatever crisis there is in the Eurozone, people don't care so much about that. It's still seen as an advantage to join. I fully agree with that. But with the internal devaluation, what you have as a problem is it's unequal who is being hit by it. And even though it might sound very rude, pensions didn't really see any cuts. And I think that will turn out to be a problem. Right? With our demographic situation shifting a lot, and I think Ed will speak about that, there will be limited possibility of financing pensions in the future. They should have been cut, and perhaps there you would have needed the external devaluation to at least reduce sort of the euro value of pensions. Right? This one I will skip and then jump there instead. And when I'm thinking about it, do we belong in the Eurozone? Well, perhaps, but I think we all have underestimated, also Estonians, Latvians, and perhaps many of you this year, that do we have a sort of inflationary discipline like the Germans? No, right? Or certainly we have underestimated what it takes, right? If you meet a person like Jürgen Stark, then well, you get this impression of how obsessed, especially Germans, are with inflation, much more than the rest. It's certainly very, very important for the Latvians. I hope that they will pay attention to that in the future, inflation discipline is much, much more important. Right? Okay, quickly here, and then I'm at the finishing line. 3 more minutes, I think, something like that. Fiscal policy has been a mess, and I would like that it was more rules-based, like they have done in Estonia, right? Let's say rules of more or less balanced budgets in, over the cycle or something like that. This country has had tons of plans for national development, but never really implemented very many of them. This is rather populist, of course, as a suggestion, but it has been very stabilizing and has been very fruitful to have the IMF and the European Union around during this stabilization program. Quite frankly, I wouldn't mind if they stayed for a long time to ensure further stability. The goal is to adopt the Euro 2014. I strongly hope that the country will pursue that goal still, and it is in the cards. We might get in trouble with the inflation criterion, but let's wait and see. It's certainly still policy, and I think it has to be done. Should one then have a devaluation, nevertheless? I'm very fearful of this here with that, basically pensions and so on will become a burden that cannot be tackled. I'm not so sure if I'm in favor of a devaluation upon euro adoption, but perhaps it should be thought of. Let's just take all of this here at once and then wrap up, right? I think we also have to be looking at that we had these fat years, and during this credit boom, the supply side was more or less forgotten because things were going so well, right? There were lack of reforms. I think we need a lot of educational reforms. I think education is not very good in the country. We can see it from the things that we produce. It's not very sort of human capital oriented goods and so forth. We were the third poorest country in the EU before the credit boom, and we're still the third poorest. And of course, mathematically, somebody always has to be the third poorest, but does it really have to be us, right? I think they should do something about that. And also, then someday somebody will write a book of another time. Would we then go through an internal devaluation again, or is it too painful? I think the question there is still open, right? But it has been very, very demanding. And then some people have been hurt very, very harshly. So whatever has to be done in Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Greece, and so on, the lesson from Latvia is that it's going to be very, very tough, right? Very tough indeed. Our president finished in his speech there with these quite fine work, start today, start right now, and I think that's also what they did. I mean, this was very, very front-loaded. The Latvian cuts, they came not as fast as they should, but they came relatively fast. There was also some of the advice coming out yesterday that in order for these stabilization programs to work, everything has to come and has to come very quickly. And I would absolutely say the same. Then it is time to say thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for the little sort of tourist photo there. Should you ever come to Riga, you must see this absolutely beautiful building, Jugendstil and so on. Sorry for the slight promotion there, but thank you very much for your attention here today. Thank you.